It was in 1965 when a movie director by the name of George Stevens set out to make a movie capturing the life of Jesus. The movie was called The Greatest Story Ever Told. That's pretty bold to say this is the greatest story ever, but in fact, I believe it is the greatest story ever. And I think Matthew, though he wrote his story a long time ago, really set out to do the very same thing, picking the storytelling genre of his day, that of writing, and capturing this greatest story ever told. As we open up Matthew and begin to look at his story, the first thing we notice as we look at this great story that he's about to open up to us is that it has one of the oddest beginnings ever. Now, if you've already begun reading Matthew, you know what I'm talking about. As you get into it in the first few paragraphs, people already begin to check out. Even though they're interested to see what Matthew has to say, they've heard about this story and they would like to find out more about this Jesus. But the way Matthew opens the story to us as 21st century North Americans especially is a very odd way of beginning his story. So I'd like to begin by reading it together. So if you happen to have your Bibles here handy, you might want to pull it out. We're going to read it together. I'm going to begin on page 170, on 1783 in our Bible. And there we find it says the Gospel of Matthew, or Gospel according to Matthew. And I'll begin with that big number 1, which is the beginning of chapter 1. And I'll just begin reading it. Let's go ahead and read this together, and we'll have a little fun with some of the names that follow. Okay, Matthew 1:1. An account of the genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac, Isaac the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar, Perez the father of Hezron, and Hezron the father of Aram, and Aram the father of Amminadab, and of Amminadab the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon the father of Salmon, and Salmon the father of Boaz by Rahab, and Boaz the father of Obed by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of King David. How are we doing so far? So far, we've got a lot of names. Let's keep going, because this is the way Matthew opens up this greatest story ever told. David, the father of Solomon, by the wife of Uriah, and Solomon, the father of Rehoboam, and Rehoboam, the father of Abijah, Abijah, the father of Asaph, and Asaph, the father of Jehoshaphat, Jehoshaphat, the father of Joram, and Joram, the father of Uzziah, Uzziah, the father of Jotham, Jotham, the father of Ahaz, and Ahaz, the father of Hezekiah, and Hezekiah, the father of Manasseh, Manasseh, the father of Amos, and Amos, the father of Josiah, and Josiah, the father of of Jeconiah, and his brothers at the time of the deportation to Babylon. And after the deportation to Babylon, Jeconiah was the father of Zalathiel, and Zalathiel the father of Zerubbabel, and Zerubbabel the father of Abiud. I'll get that one right. Now it's the hardest one of the whole bunch for me so far. And Abiud the father of Eliakim, Eliakim the father of Azor, Azar the father of Zadok, and Zadok the father of Achim, Achim the father of Eliud, and Eliud the father of Eleazar, Eleazar the father of Matthan, Matthan the father of Jacob, Jacob the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born and is called the Messiah. So all the generations from Abraham to David are 14 generations, and from David to the deportation of Babylon, 14 generations, and from the deportation of Babylon to the Messiah, 14 generations. This is how Matthew opens up this greatest story ever told. Whenever I hear or try to read through that, and maybe it's the same for you, the first thing that comes to my mind is, who are these people? Maybe that's what you're thinking as well. Maybe you can even say, did you recognize any of the names that I just read, that we read together? Most every class tells me, yes, I recognize Jesus and Mary. Sometimes we get a little further back, and maybe you're one of those who's able to catch a few other of the names, perhaps Abraham or David or Solomon. Some of these people have names that we will have a hard time pronouncing, let alone knowing who they are and why they're included in this story. But it's an important piece of this opening up of what Matthew has to say about who Jesus is. Again, remember, that is our guiding question that we're going to be looking kind of through at all that Matthew tells us. And so let's ask that question as we open up this first section of the Bible. What is, or who is Jesus, if all we had was this brief section of the book of Matthew? Well, one thing you could see for sure would be that he had a lot of ancestors, and those ancestors are significant even if we don't know them all. There's a few names that are a little bit more familiar. For example, Abraham. If you know a little bit of your Old Testament history, you know that Abraham is considered the father or the patriarch of the Jewish people. And so by being able to trace his lineage back to Abraham, it is saying to all the world that Jesus here is a Jew. That's pretty simple. By his lineage and his bloodline, he is of the Jewish race. Second thing you might do is, again, pick out some other names maybe you recognize. Maybe you recognize the name King David. David, it plays a prominent role in, again, the history of Israel in our Old Testament accounts. And as we see, David is, well, he's a king. And many of the people who followed him in that list we just read were also kings who followed after David on the royal throne of Israel until it was divided in two, and then over the nation of Judah, which was the southern part of the kingdom that continued under the house of David's rule. Also, David, it's important to note that it was the prophets would speak of the one who was coming, the Messiah, who would reign on David's throne. So being a descendant of David not only ties him to this royal line, but also to the prophetic message that the Messiah would be of David's line. Okay, so that's a good start for us. There may be other names that you picked up, and again, we'll notice that most all of this is through the men, because in a patrilineal society such as Israel in the first century, that would be a key piece. They really followed the bloodline through the males, and that's how it went down along the line. But what makes this kind of almost most interesting, to me at least, is that what sets us apart from what most genealogies of ancient Israel would look like is not just the men who are mentioned, because that's what you would expect, but also because of the women who are mentioned. And I'll mention 5, whether you recognize them as women's names, because if you know the Old Testament stories, you will recognize some of these as the women of the Old Testament. He lists 5. First one is Tamar, second is Rahab, third is Ruth, the fourth is one who is referred to as the wife of Uriah. And again, for us who know the Bible story, we know that her name was Bathsheba, and of course then Mary at the conclusion as the one who would be the mother of this Jesus that we're talking about. What makes that interesting to me is that though there are kings and people of royal lines and leaders of ethnic groups in this listing here, they also mentions a number of women who kind of cause you to pause. All 5 of these women you would probably refer to as being sexually suspect in some way as you begin to hear their stories. Either be Mary, who, though she was the mother of this Jesus, she referred to herself as being yet a virgin, and I'm sure that was questionable back in her day, even as it would be still today. But of all the others, they are either outcasts or outsiders. Rahab having children by her father-in-law. Tamar having children by her father-in-law. Rahab having had a past as a prostitute. Ruth coming from another country, again an outsider coming into the midst of the Jewish people. And then of course Bathsheba, who was married to an outsider, Uriah the Hittite, and then is part of that famous sin account of David's as he takes her as his own and then tries to cover up and ends up killing Uriah off. So it's interesting that is both those who are powerful as well as those who are outsiders are both listed as part of this ancestral tree of Jesus. Those who are the power brokers and those that you would want to be associated with, and also those who raise up some red flags, some skeletons in the closet, and yet they're all part of this mix. So who might Matthew be saying this Jesus is? Well, saying certainly he is part of this Jewish prophetic hope of a Messiah. He is certainly part of this King of David line of ancestral kings. He is the Return of the King before there was a Return of the King movie, per se. But also because of the women who are included and some of the other backstory we see, that he is also not just for the Jews, but of a wider audience as well. He has the blood of other races around also coursing through his veins. And he is both the insider as well as the answer for the outsider. So while we may not get the fullness of this story, it is securing Jesus as the answer, really, not just for this Jewish hope, but for the hope of all the world. And he does through this really odd way of retelling his ancestral genealogy. And with that, we can begin the story that becomes much more familiar as we begin to look at the birth of Jesus, something we celebrate each year at Christmas.